After all, I want to bring up our next speaker to the stage from Digital Intent. Please welcome Sean Johnson.
Hey everybody, thanks for being here. Thanks to Digital Summit for having me. Is this the clicker? How does the clicker work? So this guy? Let's see. Yes? Okay, hi. That's me. I am a partner of Digital Intent. We're a digital innovation firm in Chicago. I am also a founding partner of Founder Equity, which is an early stage venture fund. And I am a professor at Kellogg. I have a reputation at Kellogg for covering a fair amount of ground in the amount of space that I have. I've been told I only have 30 minutes, and so we only have 109 slides to cover today. So hopefully we'll be able to get through that. Let's go ahead and buckle up. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about one premise. I'm going to give you three areas in which I think you can apply that premise, and then I'm going to give you three suggestions for how you would go about implementing inside of those three areas to fulfill that one premise. Okay, let's start there. My premise, I think we need to think broader about what it is that we do as marketers. It is important that you don't just think about yourself as somebody who gets people in the door, but as becoming a core part of the product team. The reason I say that is with a lot of digital products with product teams, they usually consist of engineers, designers, maybe a product manager, maybe a project manager. Very often, marketing does not actually have a seat at the table. And so what happens is they build a product and then they throw it over the fence to marketers and say, okay, go get us some customers, right? Why is that a problem? Well, one of my early investments was a Q&A mobile platform that had a very strong founding team when it came to acquisition. They were great at testing targeting and creative and all those kinds of things. They were able to get users in the door and drive mobile app installs pretty inexpensively. And so they thought they were pretty hot stuff. And it was great. They had a little bit of churn here. This is that kind of cohort of users. They're dropping off a little bit, but every product has some churn, so that's not that big a deal. And so they saw this chart kind of going up and to the right, which is what everybody wants. And so they said, all right, we have product market fit. We need to start scaling this thing. And they confused product market fit for cheap acquisition. And what was happening was the users were not sticking around. They were kind of going out of the bottom of the funnel there. And it created a problem. And as marketers, they were thinking, all right, well, we need to get more users in. There's two ways to do that. One is to have cheaper cost per acquisition, right? The second is just to spend more money each week. And that's what they started doing because they wanted to continue to see this chart kind of going up to the right. But that becomes one, cost prohibitive eventually, and two, you reach saturation and they become more and more expensive. And so what ended up happening was it tipped over for them. And they got to a place where they couldn't keep spending more money on acquiring users, and because they were losing all of them out of the bottom, that wasn't sufficient, right? And so me as a these don't actually work, that's a video, but that's okay. That's a motorcycle that's about to drive off a cliff. That's them. And then I'm the guy on the right going, cheering them on, and then, oh no, right, as they go off that cliff. That was a hard lesson to learn. David Ogilvy basically says that marketing is not enough. In fact, if you're too good at it, it only accelerates your demise, right? You need to have a fundamentally, you need to have a solid product. So why does that matter to you guys? I believe that a great product is fundamentally about behavior change. BJ Fogg runs the Stanford Persuasion Lab, and he argues that behavior change is about three things: getting a person sufficiently motivated to change, making it easy enough for them to change, and then showing them the appropriate triggers at the appropriate time so that that change can become a habit long term, right? Marketers play a role in all three of those things. Obviously, from a motivation perspective, you're trying to kind of create motivation for them, get them excited, get them to want to do something and take an action. Ability traditionally is in the realm of kind of user experience, but I think marketing has a lot to offer there. A lot of copy inside of a user, a lot of a user experience is about copy. A lot of it is still continuing to be about persuasion and about understanding a user's sort of emotional needs at each sort of stage of that process. And then triggers are very often leveraged through mechanisms that marketers are used to using, just need to be done in a slightly different way. And so you play a role in all three of those things, and so as a result, I think that you have a huge, huge role that you can theoretically play in terms of making a product more successful. So that's my premise. There's three specific areas where I think that you can apply that premise. This is what we call the product funnel. It's basically Dave McClure's startup metrics for pirates that I put in a pretty triangle. But you've got acquisition at the top. That's what we most associate with marketing, right? Users come to our site. You got activation, not just that they register, but that they have a good first-time experience. Retention, they come back. Revenue, they generate some revenue for you either directly or through ads or whatever your monetization strategy is. And then referral, they tell their friends. Most marketers, and candidly most product teams, focus a lot of their energy on the top and the bottom, and they treat the middle as sort of this black box. Like I put money in, I do some stuff to get people to the site, and then money pops out of the bottom, right? But I would argue that these three areas in the middle are your best opportunity to kind of shore up your product. It's usually cheaper to iterate on these. It's cheaper to double your acquisition rate, for example, than it is to double your acquisition. It's more defensible because it's harder for me as a competitor to ape your referral loop than it is for me to ape your AdWords campaign. And it makes every dollar that you spend from an acquisition perspective go further, right? So those are the three areas that I think marketers can play a big role on the product team in helping manipulate. So let's talk about retention. I'm talking about retention first because if you don't have good retention, literally nothing else you do matters. It literally is the definition of a good product versus a bad product, right? And it has a huge role. Harvard did a study. They found that a 5% increase in retention rate can increase profit by 25 to 95%. That's huge. But if you think about how much money you spend to acquire a user versus keep a user, then the math makes sense, right? This is a typical retention curve. Again, you're going to plan for churn. You're going to have churn no matter what. But what you're looking for is for it to flatten off and to taper, right? Bad retention looks like this, where it never really stops. That's this chart right here. This is bad retention. This is what I saw, unfortunately, in my early days as a manager of a fund. This is kind of what we're going for. Again, very small difference if you look at it, but if you notice the bands taper off, right? And so they're able to start stacking on top of each other. That difference is the difference between failure and success, right? So what are some things that you can do as a marketer to help that? I think the biggest one is to focus on the trigger. The trigger is the thing that's going to help people create habits inside of a product. What do I mean by a trigger? There's two types. The first is internal triggers. This is the end state. You want to associate a user, you want a user to start associating their internal feelings with your product. So if I'm lonely, those are maybe some sites I go to. If I'm bored, maybe those are some sites I go to. If I'm hungry, maybe those are sites I go to. But the idea is to get to a place where you're associating my product with that sort of felt need. Right? That's hard to do. You're not going to do that out of the gates. So how do you do that? The second one is what are called external triggers or manufactured triggers. And they're a virtuous cycle because ideally every trigger kind of creates a new action which cues another trigger. There's 4 components to it. The first is the trigger itself. A bunch of different types, but just a couple that you might want to leverage. Peer-based triggers. This is probably the most common one that people associate. You create an artifact inside of a product. Other people interact with that artifact, and now you get a trigger notifying you that they interact with that, and that kind of starts that loop, right? There's others, though. There's time-based triggers that get me to kind of come back in. So if your product kind of has a time-based component, maybe it's a calendar app or a to-do list app with a reminder or something like that. There's location. So if you're an app that has kind of a geolocation component to it, you could potentially do that. There are state change triggers, so anything that's sort of news-based, or there's a status of an item that's changing over a period of time, those could generate some triggers as well, right? So that's the trigger. Then the channel. What distribution mechanism are you going to deliver that trigger through? Email, obvious one, right? Marketers, for the most part, I think are used to thinking about email as a broadcast medium or as a medium to sell sales or whatever, but transactional emails that get generated as a result of an in-app action tend to have the highest open rate, tend to have the highest click-through rate, and can be really, really valuable for you in terms of building a habit loop. The other thing I'd say about email is don't just think about it as a bolt-on to the end of the product. It can actually be a core part of the value proposition itself. So a good example, we did a project for KPMG. They have an executive sort of dashboard level. Their consultants don't want to log into yet another admin app, right? They're very, very busy people. They're traveling. So they actually saw the email report that got generated to them as being the primary mechanism through which they were interacting with the product. Right? You have to obviously measure retention differently. You're looking at different metrics and things like that. But don't just think of email as a bolt-on. But email's a huge one. Obviously, push notifications are a huge one as well if you're on a mobile app, right? It's such a big impact. Applytics did a study. They found that over a 6-month lifetime of an app, on average, apps that have push notifications enabled have a double retention rate than ones that don't. You want to be careful about when you ask for a notification. A lot of apps make the mistake of just because it's done by developers, they just open up the app for the very first time, they prompt you with that notification right away. As a user, I don't know why I would opt into those notifications, and I say no, right? You only get one, on iOS at least, you only get one kind of bullet in your chamber with that, and if I say no, these are the steps I would have to go through to turn it back on. Odds are I'm not going to do that, right? So as a marketer, you need to be thinking about when is the optimal time in my customer's journey with that product to get them to want to opt in. Others are in-app notifications. If it's a product that you keep open on a regular basis, Slack is a great example. That stupid little red dot that drives me crazy all day long. Fantastic at kind of creating a habit loop, right? So those are some channels. What's the reward, right? Different rewards. There might be sort of an ego reward. Again, I post something. When you post something on social, you probably look at your phone more often than other times, right? Works for B2B too. Gratify my ego. You tell me that I'm special. I'm part of a special club or whatever. That's gonna, the open rate on that's probably gonna be really high. Mastery, so this is Stack Overflow. It's a Q&A platform for developers. They have a badge-based gamification system. It makes me feel special because I'm adding value to the community. It makes me want to do more of it, right? Control, I'm a big Inbox Zero guy. I love seeing that little beach chair, clearing out my inbox, right? Discovery. Social apps, one of the things they have is what's called infinite variability. You get a little dopamine hit every time you open up the app because you think there might be something interesting there. You don't know what it's going to be yet, right? And so that creates sort of a habit loop as well. So reward, and then the last thing is an action. Again, ideally that action that I take queues up another trigger either for myself or for somebody else that's on the platform and starts that whole loop over again. So looking at Slack again, I mention somebody, they get a push notification, they're curious about what it has to say, or they just want to clear it out, right? So they go in and then they maybe mention somebody else or they mention me back and I start that whole cycle again, right? We advocate creating something called a retention map. Identify every single trigger. We got this from a guy named Brian Balfour. Identify every single trigger that you can find inside of your product. Think about what channel you would deliver it in. Think about what the reward is so that you can tailor the copy for that. And then think about what the action is that you want them to take that will theoretically load that next loop. Make sense? So that's retention. Retention is not just the only thing, though. We want to focus on activation as well. Reason why, one of the problems with retention is that it's a lagging indicator. It took those guys a long time to realize that the people were all dropping out of the funnel, right? So the great thing about activation is that it is a leading indicator. If I can increase my day 1 retention or my day 7 retention, that tends to play itself out over the rest of the customer's lifetime with my product, right? So that's fantastic. And it's important because the average mobile app loses 80% of their users within 3 days. That's broken out just a little more detail. This is the difference between the top 10 apps. This is on the Android store. Top 10 apps versus next 50, next 100, next 5,000. What you notice here is almost the entire ballgame happens in the beginning, right? That whole product market fit thing, the whole game is won there. They tend to have similar retention curves after that initial experience. So that's critically important for us to get right. How do we go about doing that? Use the same principles that you use for conversion optimization, right? Don't have conversion optimization stop when they register. Think about it all the way through. And most people don't do this. Most companies don't do this. Designers, they design their product with the ideal state in mind. So you get these comps for your marketing pages or whatever. They look like this. They don't often spend a lot of time thinking about the onboarding process to get me there. And so I get a screen like this when I register. Kind of sad, right? An app that's based on friends to be useful. They picture this, and this is what I have, right? User-generated content site. I'm going to build it, and everybody's going to come, right? And it looks like this. And so I come in. I don't want to create any content because nobody else has. I leave. You're dropping all your users out of the bottom, right? What we're trying to do is get people to what we call the aha moment. That's where we get that light bulb to kind of go on for them, and they understand what the product does for them and how it can be useful. And it's about 2 things. It's about motivation and it's about ability. Creating that motivation in me and making it sufficiently easy for me to do. The aha moment, a great example is Twitter. They found that if I follow 5 to 10 people on the first day, I'm much, much more likely to be a long-term user of the product. And so they redesigned the entire onboarding experience to get you to follow those 5 to 10 people. They created what they call a ladder of engagement. There's a whole bunch of things that you can theoretically do inside of Twitter, but they realized that they need to meter that out to you, and only as your engagement level deepens do they want you to do those other actions. They were smart enough to realize, for example, that most people on user-generated content sites are lurkers. members. They don't actually create content, they just consume it. So they didn't worry about you creating tweets up front. All they wanted you to do was follow some people and get you to consume content, then start checking your timeline more, then get you to download the app, so now you're looking at it on 2 different platforms, right? They're trying to get you hooked in over a period of time. So how do you figure this out if you are, for your product? One is look at the data and see what behaviors are predictive of retention, right? So maybe you have a product that has 3 different features. If you break out which feature the user used first, how does that impact retention? That can be a really, really valuable tool. Get out and actually talk to people, right? Quantitative metrics are good at telling you what happened and why something is busted. They're not great at telling you why. Ask people why they started using the product in the first place. Of these 3 things that you could theoretically do, why do you use this one? Why is this one the most important? And then map every step that it takes from visiting the site to actually activating, not just signing up, right? You find here, you'll see a curve probably similar to this, and that's fine. But what's important is let's make some changes here. A 6% increase at each step of that process, which is relatively easy to do, leads to about a 74% increase in my activation rate at the end, right? Because you have downstream effects. One other thing that you can do is look at channels. Different channels tend to have different behavior inside of the app. So an app that might be cheap to acquire, or a channel rather, might be cheap for acquisition, they might have vastly different behavior once they get inside of the product and may actually be less valuable to you. And there's things you could do there. You could either say, all right, well, maybe we should divert money from that channel to another one. The other thing you do is maybe you create different activation flows by channel and see if that kind of manipulates things. There we go. Other things you can do user tests. Have a seat at the table at the user test, right? You can use usertesting.com. Benefit is it's pretty cheap and you get results really quickly. You can use heuristic models. This is the lift model by a guy named Chris Goward from Wider Funnel. The idea here is look at every single one of those pages through each one of these lenses. Is the value proposition clear? Is it relevant to me? Is there anything on this page that's creating anxiety for me? Anything that's distracting? Anything I can do to create urgency? Just ask yourself each one of those questions on each one of those pages. Odds are you might find an area for an opportunity for improvement. Do teardowns. We do teardowns at our company all the time of onboarding experiences for products, and we've created a swipe file that we use internally of interesting design patterns or things that novel approaches to kind of solving a particular problem. Games are a really great place to kind of look for data on that. They are very, very good at progressive sort of engagement and getting you to interact with one thing first, making it really, really simple to complete that first level. Angry Birds is a great example. People understand Angry Birds in 10 seconds. They understand how it works. They don't make it hard for you. They make it super, super easy, and then they progress it up as you become a power user. You can do the same thing with your product. Oh, that's an example. And then they gave me stars. They made me feel good about myself. Okay, that's activation. The third one is referral, right? Referral's pretty obvious. People think referral is something that only happens inside of social networks. This is an example of Slack's curve. It's an example of what we call reverse churn. So every user I get actually turns into, if you think about it, that product is only useful to me if I get a bunch of my other coworkers or whatever to use it. So every single user turns into more users, which is fantastic. Not every product has a quote-unquote viral kind of nature to them, but everybody has some sort of virality to them, and there are things that you can implement there. Generally, 3 reasons why people will share and invite. First is ego. Most relevant for user-generated content sites, social networks, things like that. If you define ego relatively broadly, I'm interesting, I'm smart, whatever. The second one is utility. They're bidding up a fax machine, it's not playing. Fax machine is only useful if more people use it. So B2C products, SaaS products, you want to play to the utility angle. And then the third is money. So e-commerce tends to kind of default towards that. You see a lot of the double symmetric referral bonus type of thing. There's 2 different types of invite loops to be thinking about. The first is the one that everybody thinks of. You invite your friends, some percentage of them click through, some % sign up, right? The one thing I would encourage you to do is not just think about invite kind of during registration. Think about every opportunity again to potentially invite people. An example is Asana, to-do list app. You can use that as a single person. They call it single player utility, all you want. But every single time you create a new task, there's a little button that says assign. And if I assign that, it opens up a dialogue where I might want to invite somebody, and all of a sudden now it's a collaboration tool, right? The ideal is a loop where the more, if I invite you and you start using the product, again, you start triggering notifications back to me and you make the product more useful to me. So not only do I get a new user, but I also get a more engaged referrer as well. That's what you're trying to shoot for. And the other thing I would suggest from invites is not just think about me inviting one other person, think about channels, right? The most famous the thing that started the growth hacking movement, this was an article from Andrew Chen, was talking about how Airbnb got started. They hacked Craigslist, basically. They added a little button to post to Craigslist. Craigslist had no public API, and they figured out a way to have Airbnb listings publish automatically on Craigslist. Craigslist eventually figured that out, shut them down, but by then they had already had some traction, right? Key point here, again, having a marketer on the product team, right? The engineer probably wouldn't have thought of that by themselves. The marketer can't implement that by themselves. Having you on the team together is super, super important to execute on that kind of stuff. The other loop to be thinking about is the user-generated content loop. Again, if you have a user-generated content site, developers tend to keep all that stuff behind an authentication system, and it's kind of a walled garden, right? They're not naturally thinking, hey, some of these artifacts users are creating might be useful to Google or might be useful to other users. So think about, hey, is there a public version of this data that I can publish out on Google, capture long-tail search, and generate some referral that way? So those are the 3 areas I think that you should focus your energy on as a marketer in the context of a product team. 3 suggestions for how to do that. The first is to become what we call a full-stack marketer. Again, Brian Balfour created what we call the T-curve for the T-shaped marketer. The idea here is that as a marketer, you probably have areas of specialty. So in this case, we have email and we have content marketing where I go really deep and I become an expert on it. But there's lots of other areas where you can add value. And the reason why this is important is because the product team's really busy. They have a backlog. They already have other things that they're working on. To the degree that you can take an idea further and help them out, that's better for you, right? It'll make it a lot more likely that your initiatives will get the traction that they need. So for example, there's a guy on our team that started off as a marketer, was really great at paid acquisition, taught himself SQL so he could dig into those reports. Because for example, finding that aha moment is really hard inside of Google Analytics. You have to kind of get into the database itself to kind of find those kinds of things that are predictive of long-term engagement. So he could find that himself. He then could kind of prototype, just using wireframes or Balsamic or whatever, some solutions. Eventually he taught himself Sketch so he could actually design some things, and the designers would give him a UI kit and he could mess around with some stuff. Eventually, he taught himself some HTML and CSS so he could implement landing pages and get things up himself. And what that allowed him to do was go from 0 to implemented in a much narrower period of time without creating a burden on the rest of the product team. And it just made it a lot more likely that his ideas were kind of going to get the traction that they need. So that's number 1. And I would suggest kind of creating a competency model for yourself and just look at it. Like, let's set some goals. Maybe these are the things I'm good at. 12 months from now, what's 1 area or 2 areas where I want to kind of try to get good? This is a 10-year journey, not a 3-month journey, right? Number 2, start modeling. I'm a big believer in models for growth. And I think they're great for a couple of things. 1, they show me the future. So I use these a lot when I get a pitch deck from somebody and they tell me they're raising, $1 million. They're going to use 500 of it for marketing. And I say, how are you planning on getting X number of users that you're saying you're going to get? And they say, content. And I'm like, what does that mean, right? Let's get into the details. It's great for setting goals for your team that are realistic and accurate. They're great for prioritizing. You can do sensitivity analysis around them. And then managing to objectives. This is what we thought would happen. Here's what actually happened, right? So for each one of those things, so activation, right? There were all of those steps, plot it all out in a model. Show each one of those percentages is a variable that you can implement and try to run experiments on to improve performance on, right? Same thing with retention. Let's model out what does our retention curve look like, and what can we do to kind of manipulate that. Similarly, every single invite loop that I have in my product, what can I do there? Every single step there. The texts that's sent in the invite, the dialogue where I get somebody to refer. Can I increase the number of invites that you send from 2 to 3, right? That's material, that's a huge impact. What's the conversion rate on that text message that you send or that email that you send, right? Do I need a different registration flow for referrers than I do for my, don't send them to a homepage maybe. Maybe I send them to a specific personalized page. Those are all experiments I can run. And then those all roll up, and I can see if I do these things, how will that impact my North Star metric, in this case, monthly active users. Just as an aside, I think you should do this for acquisition too. So again, that example of that guy, I'm going to do content marketing. What does that mean? How many articles are you going to write? What do you think your average search engine position is going to be? What's the click-through rate if you're in position 10, right? What does that mean for my acquisition cost, right? Try to back into those numbers. And then the last one is to commit to a cadence of rapid iteration. So this is the build, measure, learn loop from Lean Startup. The idea here is that to the degree that you can maximize your speed through that loop, you will be more successful. And so what that looks like for us is we have ideation sessions. We do all those ideas we were talking about, user tests, heuristics, teardowns. We plot them. You can put them in Excel. You can put them in Trello, whatever you want. And then we prioritize them. We use something called the ICE framework. So impact, how likely is it to impact results if it's successful? How confident are we that it's going to be successful? How easy will it be to implement? Ease, you can get an estimate from your designers and developers. Confidence is probably a function of, have we done this before, candidly? And then impact, that's where that model comes into play again, because you can do sensitivity analysis. Let's say we try to manipulate this step of activation versus this step of referral next. What would be the impact on monthly active users, right? And then just see how it works. This is a triangle chart. I love when I see our startup teams using these charts, because that tells them each row here is a cohort of users, right? And each column is their retention rate over time. This tells us are the changes that we're making working, because cohort 5 is interacting with a fundamentally different product than cohort 1 if we're actually committing to this and doing it well. So that's it. Get more involved in the product process, specifically around activation, retention, and referral. In order to do that, become full stack, or as full stack as you can. Use models to kind of manage yourself and commit to an iterative process. 109 slides. I think we have extra time. This is just going to make everything that you do as a marketer easier, right? A great product will make every user that you acquire cheaper, and it'll make sure that every dollar you spend goes a lot further. So that's it. Thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it.